On behalf of the Friends of the Harriet Beecher Stowe House, we respectfully acknowledge that the ground on which we stand are the traditional Miami and Shawnee lands. We extend our esteem and gratitude to the indigenous people who call this place home. Welcome to another episode of the Power of Voice discussion series. And I want to acknowledge our sponsors for the series, which include School Outfitters. School Outfitters works hard to bring learning space visions to life. To learn more about their services, visit the website at schooloutfitters.com. And then also Hindman, an internationally recognized fine art auction house. And their information can be found at hindmanauctions.com as well. And I do want to give a shout out to the School Outfitters because they did give us a discount when we recently purchased 5 picnic tables that have been installed in our outdoor classroom. So there's still a little tweaking left to be done when we with the mulch, but for the most part, it's about ready to go. So if you have not seen it, I know Marty has, if you have not seen it, make sure you come over to the house and look on the north lawn because it looks great. And we're very excited about being able to utilize some additional outdoor space, particularly because our interior space is contracting with the restoration efforts. And so this will give us some opportunities and we'll be able to utilize it potentially starting on Friday when we have a 5th grade class coming. So, all right, so I'm done with my spiel. I'm going to turn it over to John Getz, who is our perennial leader of this discussion, and he's going to introduce Emma, our co-leader, and we'll go from there. John?
Yeah, I want to start in a different way tonight by introducing Emma Baldwin, the co-leader tonight. And I've asked her to say just a little bit about her citizenship in the Miami tribe of Oklahoma and why that's an important part of her life. So Emma?
Hi, I'm very happy to be here actually. This is my first book discussion I've ever done, so I'm very excited. But yes, as John said, I am a citizen of the Miami tribe of Oklahoma. And as Christina said, like our tribe is from this land. And so kind of living here now, which I moved here about 2 years ago. So I haven't been here that long, but living here now is pretty important to also connecting with how we were also from here. So learning about, you know, our removal and just rereading all of that as an adult. And because a lot of that I didn't learn as much as a kid. So more so now I can understand it a lot more. But a lot of our gatherings and stuff have moved to Oklahoma because that's where a lot of us have ended up at. So yeah, I'm happy to answer any questions you guys have about that.
We can do that now, or we can do it later if they come up.
Question. So from what you just said, Emma, it seems that your story is just the opposite of the story we're talking about tonight. That she started out with her tribe and moves away back, but still moves further away. You started out away and are moving back in. Is that, am I interpreting, is that a story I can say is true?
A little bit, yeah. So our language was kind of forgotten for a while, and my dad actually helped bring back the language, which I grew up learning. So I grew up learning about my culture and my language, but about like the history and stuff, I'm kind of more recently acknowledging or more understanding, having a more understanding of that. So it is kind of similar or kind of opposite, I would say, yeah.
Anyone else want to ask anything right now from Emma?
Emma, I'll give you a little bit of a softball here, but I know you have other family members that live in this area too. It's not that you're the only one here from your family or your tribe. Do you mind telling us a little bit about that?
Yeah, other than myself, my older brother lives over in Oakley, and my sister is she's outside of Cincinnati, but she's close. She's about 45 minutes away in Wilmington. But we have not just my family, but like tribal family. We have some people that we know that live in this area as well. And we'll sometimes gather as just kind of friends or tribal friends, family, and we'll play traditional games and we'll just kind of get together, which is really nice outside of major gatherings that we have.
Anybody else? Well, feel free as we go along. Chris, could you put up the map for starters?
Yes, give me 1 second because when I turned my computer back on, I forgot to pull all of them up, but they should be right here. Okay. Let me go to map. Here we go.
Okay, this is, yeah, thank you. This is an old map. You can tell it's old because it describes the Inuits as Eskimos, which is not a term we use anymore. But it gives you an idea of some of the major Native American cultures. So that one thing I used to do when I taught this book with students was to say, well, there isn't just a Native American culture. There are many, many of them. And in fact, they're sometimes grouped in this way, as I've tried to highlight the group names. Eastern Woodlands, which would be where the Miami tribe originated in our area, and going on back up to the Northeast, living in a more forested area and obviously adapting a lifestyle to that. The Southeastern Indians, or Native Americans, the Southeast, the supposed 5 civilized tribes, as they were called in the 19th century, the Creeks, Cherokees, Choctaws, Chickasaws, and Seminoles, in the northeastern part of what's the U.S. today, many of them had developed an agrarian lifestyle there. If you go ahead to the Plains group, in the middle of the country, that's where Zitkala-Sa comes from. And they followed the buffalo. These were the Native Americans that we associate sometimes with the West, with wigwams, and moving with the buffalo herds, which were one of their main sources of sustenance. And of course, when the buffalo were wiped out or nearly wiped out for the Transcontinental Railroad and other settlements, it displaced, it took away their livelihood. If you go to the Southwest, those are the Pueblos that some of you, I'm sure, have visited at one time or another. And from there, we get writers today like Leslie Marmon Silko, and Barbara Kingsolver is not Native American, but some of her books draw on this Southwestern Native culture. And then probably the other one that is most distinctively different from all of these is the Northwest. If you go up to the Northwest coast, and obviously the opportunity, the Southwestern natives tended to be farmers and ranchers as well. If you go up to the Northwest coast, what do you have? A plentiful supply of fish and shellfish from the ocean. And so their culture, and that's the culture that we associate with totem poles, and it's a much more sea-based culture. So this is just a very general description. Obviously, within all of these groups, you have different dialects, different languages. It's a highly diverse group. Though they obviously have some things in common too. But I just want to get across the idea that we're looking at one small segment of Native American history when we look at Zitkala-Sa. So let's go to the timeline. If anybody has questions about any of that, about the map. So Chris will put that up for us.
Give me just a second. There we go.
Thank you. Many of you have got this already, so you had a chance to look at it. It's not a proud history from a white perspective, obviously in the treatment of Native Americans. The first attempt by Congress was to pass that Civilization Fund Act, as if Native Americans weren't civilized, encouraging Christian missions to try to educate them. And then the Bureau of Indian Affairs was created in 1824. A connection with Harriet Beecher Stowehouse, Catherine and Harriet Beecher and their students in 1829 were writing letters and circulating petitions in support of the Cherokee Nation in the American Southeast, keeping its ancestral land, because there was an attempt already well underway to try to relocate that group and to take the land from them. I mentioned William Apessa's work, just so you know, there were Native Americans writing here and protesting, telling their story and protesting the treatment of their people. He was a Pequot, Northeastern Indian Native American. A terrible moment, 1830, Congress passes the Indian Removal Act, which was promoted by Andrew Jackson, the president, to relocate Eastern Native Americans, and that was west of the Mississippi, into what would then be called the Indian Territory in what is today Oklahoma. This was Jackson's big achievement, and from his perspective, and it involved the Creeks, the Cherokees, the Choctaws, the Chickasaws, and the Seminoles primarily at that time, but as Emma indicated, other groups were being moved as well and had their own trails of tears. Interestingly, the Indian Removal Act was opposed by Davy Crockett, of all people. He was a senator from a congressman from Tennessee at that point. And in his autobiography, just a couple of years later, he wrote, "I believed it was a wicked, unjust measure. I voted against this Indian bill, and my conscience yet tells me that I gave a good, honest vote, and one that I believe will not make me ashamed in the day of judgment." Well, it cost him a seat in Congress. He was not reelected, but he did eventually get reelected to that seat, but he had to sit out for a while. 1838 is the Trail of Tears. You all know that story and the sadness that goes with that. Let's skip ahead to 1876, the Great Sioux War of 1876, or the Black Hills War. This is the famous Custer's Last Stand was part of this, but also the Native American Alliance lost that war. And it is at this very time, 1876, this crucial year in relations between whites and Native Americans, that Gertie Felker, that was her birth name, is born. Our author that we're looking at tonight, near the Yankton Indian Agency in Greenwood, South Dakota. But her father, a white man, left before his daughter was even born. So her mother took the last name Simmons, which was her prior husband's name. He was deceased, but she went back to that name. And so young Gertie Felker became Gertrude Simmons. And she, as a teenager, a young adult, invented herself and chose the name Zitkala-Sa, which means red bird. She named herself, as so many of the writers we've been seeing over the past couple of years have done. Booker T. Washington had to do it. Toni Cade Bambara named her, self-named her, chose her own name. That was not her birth name. And of course, if we go on, Booker T. Washington chose the last name Washington. And you can, Frederick Douglass even, that was not his original name. So interesting the way these writers and political figures fashion themselves. And she said this, then I chose to make a name for myself. And I guess I have made it, made Zitkala-Sa her own. For sure, Italy writes it in her own native language. So she became a world-renowned author. That's the author talking there in a letter. 1879 marks the beginning of the boarding school movement. Many documentaries have been done about this in recent years. The terrible attack on Native American culture that was done. And Carlisle Indian Industrial School was the first of those in '79. Simmons, as you know from reading the selections, left her home to study at White's Manual Institute in Wabash, Indiana, a Quaker boarding school. You read about her experiences there. Returned to the reservation a few years later, the very year that Congress passed the Dawes General Allotment Act, providing for the distribution of tribal reservation land among individual Native Americans. The idea was break up the tribes, allot each individual person or family a certain amount of land. The idea was there were some benevolent people who thought this was a good idea to try to help Native Americans assimilate into white culture, but it obviously was a disaster and not altogether benevolent either, because I think people saw this as a way to grab Native American land by encouraging the holders to sell their land. 1890 is Wounded Knee, you know that story. It's around that time that she returns to White's, completes her study there, starts studying piano and violin, and eventually becomes a very accomplished violinist. She graduates from White's in 1895, and her graduation speech is a protest against the unequal treatment of women in general. She went to Earlham Quaker School, many of you would know it, over in Richmond, Indiana. And that's where she wins the oratorical contest. We'll talk about that. I've got question marks after the date 1897, where she teaches music and oratory at Carlisle. We know that she went back and went to Carlisle and taught there. The exact dates are a little hazy. I got different reads from different biographers of her. So somewhere in there, she goes to Carlisle and teaches there for a year or two. She also goes, after that, she goes to Boston to study music and piano. Did she go to the New England Conservatory of Music? We really don't know. Some earlier biographers said, yes, she did. I don't know if she claimed that. There's no record of her studying there, but she may have, we don't know. We know that Carlisle called her back to play violin with the band at the Paris Exposition. They were trying to put together kind of a dream team of musicians who had been in any way associated with Carlisle. So they wanted her violin talents to be on display in Paris. And it was a trip to Paris for her. She starts publishing the essays, autobiographical essays that you read in 1900 in mainstream publications, the Atlantic Monthly. She was published there. The next year, she's publishing short stories in Harper's, another big magazine of the day, and also Everybody's Magazine. You'll see a passage in green there, the only green in here. I highlighted that because it seemed to fit so well with our theme of the power of voice. Hearing that Richard Pratt, who is the founder and the head of Carlisle School, called her stories trash, he was not pleased, obviously, with what she was writing, and called her worse than pagan. She writes in a letter, "I won't be another mouthpiece. I will say just what I think." Well, there's a powerful voice, and she will obviously use it as time goes on to speak on behalf of her people. She eventually marries Raymond Bonin, so her name is often given as Gertrude Bonin. If you met her, probably she would be introduced as Gertie or Gertrude Bonin. Zitkala-Sa becomes kind of a pen name, but also reflects her activism on behalf of her people. She published in American Indian Stories, which includes the stories you read. That was in 1921 in book form, as well as some other stories. And that dovetails with Native American, a couple big events in Native American history. In 1924, it's weird even to say this, Native Americans are granted US citizenship in 1924. Well, they were here before any of the whites were here. Why didn't, but they needed citizenship rights to be made official. And then the Merriam Report in 1928, she was an advisor. She was very active on behalf of Native American causes, writing on their behalf. She was an advisor to this report that showed how bad things had become on the reservations as a result of the General Allotment Act. And that led directly to the Indian Reorganization Act, ending the policy of allotments of communal tribal lands to individuals and giving Native American tribes more control over their internal affairs. So she was quite the writer and quite the activist on behalf of her people. So I hope that gives you kind of a background, sets the scene, and let's turn it over to Emma to ask the first of our discussion questions.
Thank you. Well, after reading all of this, did anybody, did any of your knowledge enhance after reading this of your knowledge of like Native American history? Did any of that change? Did you learn something new? Anything like that?
I can start. So I guess I had always, because I was a history teacher, I knew that there was the Indian boarding schools and stuff like that. And I think my first time that I learned about that was when I was a kid. I have no idea how old I was, but I read this series of autobiographies when I was a kid that I got out of the school library, and the series, they were all like about these like famous Americans, but they were like about the famous Americans' childhood. So who knows exactly how much was true and how much was kind of like, made up about what the author thought that the kid's childhood would be like based on how they turned out. But I do remember reading one of these books about Jim Thorpe. And Jim Thorpe was, an American Indian who, got all these gold medals in the Olympics, and then they got taken away because he like supposedly became professional athlete at some point and didn't tell anybody. And so anyway, but, a good chunk of this book about his childhood was set at the Haskell Indian School. And I want to say it was in Kansas, but I don't know for sure. And then I think Carlisle was in that as well. So those were kind of my first experiences with the idea that, Native children were sent to these Indian schools. And it was basically to take away their culture, and so that they would like learn English and learn to assimilate into white society. So these readings really just kind of reiterated that and showed that she was, she experienced these same things. And she was 8 years old when she first left the reservation, which was, I thought, a little young, but to go away to boarding school. But so that's, kind of my impression was that it kind of just reinforced that idea that I had learned at some point in the past.
If I can add one, having lived in Kansas City for a while I was studying, Haskell College, which is in Lawrence, Kansas, is a very well-known American Indian school, and it's not it's run by Native Americans, and it's a very good school in the humanities. It's very small. They actually have increased a bit in the sciences. They actually have an American Chemical Society certified degree, which they have to do along with the University of Kansas, which is not too far away from them. But it's a very, very strong liberal arts college, and predominantly it was formed for Native Americans, and it's predominantly still the faculty and the students are predominantly Native American at Haskell College. Now, but one thing, going back to Emma's question, it wasn't so much the history that I learned, but it was the empathy. So what happens is I think you can learn just history, but when you read short stories that are personal, the part that I enjoyed the most, there's more to this story, but the part that I enjoyed the most was her story of her running in the woods and in the fields with her innocence as a child and how they looked at nature and played together. And it made her so human, and that was a different empathy that I felt for Native Americans that I've ever felt before. I thought that, especially the beginning of the story of her childhood remembrances with her mother and with her playmates, was just was moving to me.
I'd like to.
Oh, go ahead.
Oh, okay. I'd like to agree with that because I did that particular part. I just felt was so genuine, and it didn't have that overlay of the imposed culture, the imposed white culture on it. You know, it made me wonder how she would have used her talents if she hadn't gone to these schools. And she seems like such a gifted individual that she would find a way. My experience with Native Americans, I embarrassed to say it, but I didn't know about the Indian schools or very much about it until fairly recently. And a lot of what I've heard is really awful because it's been the recent news about the discovery of burial places and lost children who were just never accounted for. So it's been really severe. Because I lived most of my adulthood in the West Coast, and I knew some people with Native heritage, it seems like the West Coast is a different experience. One of my close friends is part of the Yakima tribe, and another is Modoc, and it may be that their ancestors weren't removed because it seems like there's more continuity in their culture. You know, there wasn't this break where they lost the language and then had to relearn it, which is so common. I have another friend who's Abenaki, which is a Northeastern indigenous group, and he's had to relearn a lot of his culture. So just seeing how much variety and experience it is, you know, it's like you look at Europe and it's like, it's just as varied. The one common experience is having your culture taken away, I think. At least my reading of it is, you know, it seems like that's the common experience of Native Americans, is having your culture discounted and taken away. Okay, that's it.
I was just going to say really briefly, I was aware of the boarding school experience, but I was not aware of the geography. I was surprised to learn that there were that these schools were east of the Mississippi also. I grew up under the impression that it was all west of the Mississippi. So I was really startled that it's like right here.
Go ahead, Amy. She's always so polite.
I try to raise my hand so I don't talk over people. So I think the challenge, and this sort of answers the question, but I'm sorry that part of it doesn't. One of the challenges that I think I'm having is that our discussion is on voice, and we have a writer now who's brilliant with the English language, but it's hard for me to let go of the fact that that's not her language, that was forced on her. And I'm having a really hard time, like, I'm feeling very emotional, like out of nowhere. And I'm ashamed to say the only Native writer I had ever written prior to this was N. Scott Momaday in college. His works were assigned as well. But I can't even begin to imagine how challenging that is to have a culture imposed on you. And I'm sorry if none of this comes out right, because I'm just kind of formulating it. And you have to then excel in like language as a writer that isn't yours, not even by your choice. It's not like she chose to move to another country and had to learn, say, Spanish or Italian. This was an imposition, and I'm having a challenge with that. So I just kind of wanted to raise that because I feel like this is a good group to raise that with.
Well, I think that's a really important question, Amy. And in a way, I think maybe you're asking us to look at the fourth question. Maybe we should skip ahead to that. Since that question, the fourth question says, this critic describes the author as one of the first American Indians to use English, the written dominant language, in conjunction with Dakota oral tradition to create a new Indian rhetoric. This is always the challenge for the colonized person, the colonized writer. Do you write in the colonizer's language, or do you stick with your own language? And this is the way she resolved it. I mean, she was coming from an oral culture. She was coming from a culture that clearly didn't have the power that white pale-face culture had. Her choice to write in English is partly that, I think, to reach the audience that had power to change things. Had she written, and I mean, you hear this constantly with post-colonial writers in Africa, post-colonial writers in almost any country. Why aren't you writing in our language? Why are you writing in the language of the oppressor? Well, here's what she said about that. I want to transplant the native spirit into the English language, since America in the last few centuries has acquired a second tongue. She's flipping things around here and saying, the second tongue is English. It's not the Native American languages. They're the first languages. But she's trying to get some of that spirit, that tone into her writing of English. So I guess the question number 4, if we skip ahead to that, is, does her language in the excerpts you read seem to you this new rhetoric that's different from the English you're used to reading? Did she accomplish her goal?
Go ahead, Kara.
Well, I don't know. I'm not really answering that question as much, but I think it kind of connects to it. And it was something that had been bothering me too. I have to be honest, I didn't read all of the reading. I read parts of it. But I feel like it's a little bit of what John was just saying of she's writing in English because she's trying to reach the audience who can do something. And I think it's similar to, like, you know, Harriet Beecher Stowe. She was able to reach more like women and kind of, you know, through sympathy, able to like connect more to, so where people felt the horror of slavery. And so Zitkala-Sa is writing in a way that can connect to people. And I mean, she writes as a woman and she writes about being a child. And so I think those are going to attract the attention of people who even though they're white, don't always have the power. Like that, you know, like John says, she's writing for the audience that can change things. But I thought it interesting that her graduation speech focused on the unequal treatment of women. So she writes about that and doesn't necessarily write about how, you know, they're taking away the Native American cultures at these schools. And then also, and you guys correct me because I don't know the whole story, but like with her at the Carlisle Indian Industrial School, like that she taught there, it's quite like, so was she teaching there so that she could kind of like a social justice teacher, so she could teach and give them the tools that they needed so that they could make a change? Because it almost seems like she's working within the white system to like it could almost seem like she's going along with the white system instead of trying to change it, if that makes sense.
I'll take a stab at answering that. I think that she went there with good intentions, and the more she saw that, the more she thought things through, the more she became disenchanted with that. I think she was trying to empower her own people, but she didn't stay there very long. It was just a year or two. And she left, she resigned because she was out of sympathy with the goals. And that's when she starts writing these pieces that you read, looking back on her experiences at White's. I think it took her a while, as it would with anybody, I think, to kind of grow up and process what had been done to her in those schools and what she was doing. And some of it was when Carlisle sent her on a recruiting trip back to the reservation. And again, she saw how conditions had deteriorated there, how the Bureau of Indian Affairs was, the whites were taking that over and were exploiting the Native Americans, enriching themselves with the money that was supposed to be flowing to the good of the people. And I think she just became more and more disillusioned and felt like she needed to do something about it. But I think she went to Carlisle still trying to do something positive, but felt that she couldn't function in that environment really and do what she wanted to do.
And I have to wonder how many opportunities she had for employment that time. As a woman, as a Native American, you know, what were her options? It's that the thing that John keeps bringing up is that you address colonialism without somehow engaging in the language of the colonizer. You know, how do you address and try to recapture your culture without engaging there? I mean, it was hard enough to get it taken seriously as a woman seeking work outside traditional fields. When back in the early 80s, I can't imagine, and I'm talking 1980s, I can't imagine 100 years earlier. That must have been amazing. She must have been amazing.
Well, she was amazing, and she did wind up working in the Bureau of Indian Affairs for a while, along with her husband. And they both spent a lot of time on a reservation in Utah, trying to make things better for the Native Americans there.
I think part of it goes back to the idea that, yes, she's writing in English, but what were her other options? You know, if you look at the Dakota tradition, it's a very oral tradition. I'm not aware of, and I could be wrong, but I'm not aware of a written Dakota language. I know Sequoia was the one that kind of devised a written language for the Cherokee, but I don't know what other written native languages there are. And so if it's not, you know, like a possibility to write in her, you know, Dakota, what other options does she have, particularly if she wants to share these stories? You know, she's used to this oral tradition, which is great, for storytellers, but that's not a very wide audience. So if you want your story to go to more people, you have to utilize the medium that's going to go to more people. Carrie, did you have something else? Your hand's still up. Amy, go ahead.
Well, and I want to thank you all because I think that helps a lot to place things into perspective, and it also calls back to the conversation that those of us who were able to be here last month had regarding, you know, Booker T. Washington and W.B. Du Bois and the value of education and how that all fit into their perspectives. I think they kind of, it's almost like the writers are all in conversation with each other, even though they didn't probably intend to be. But it feels like it, as someone kind of looking at them all in their totality, that they're conversing with each other in ways that they didn't intend, which is kind of a fascinating. I'm gonna think about that and kind of ponder that for a while.
There's a fancy term that English majors use for that called intertextuality, where texts talk to each other over time in unexpected ways.
I feel like I had to write an essay once upon a time on that.
So we could go back to this question of the language in the book if you want to, and see if it felt to you like other texts you've read. Could this have been written by somebody who was not Native American? Would it read differently for you? Would it be it's somebody writing about the same thing, but just telling her story, which is what sometimes you get in, there were some Native American stories that were then written down and retold by white people. There's kind of a tradition of that through the 19th century, writing down Native American folk tales and retelling them. But these are whites, and you don't know what kind of spin they're putting on them when they do that. Amy?
So I like someone said before, I actually don't have all of the stories because I accidentally printed the wrong pages. But one of the stories that just struck me and was hard to read that I don't think could have come from another writer was The Cutting of My Long Hair. And the reason I say that is because my very, very, very limited understanding is that hair would have been a very cultural significant marker, for lack of a better word. And so to have your culture stripped in a physical way, and you know, to kind of quote from the story, she talks about how she's not going to go, I won't submit, I'll struggle first. As a child being forced to cut your hair, like it, you know, in 21st century America that we're in now, it's like, oh, okay, a haircut's not that big a deal, but to some people it's a really big deal. And when you're forced to have that, that's huge. And I'm not sure that that vignette could come from another writer with the same pack of punch, if that makes sense.
Yes, I also believe that the language she uses throughout, she refers right from the very beginning when she has to get onto a train as an iron horse. And she does that so smoothly. She refers many times to looking out and seeing horizons, and she uses that both metaphorically and in a language that I don't think would normally be used by somebody that was from a different culture. So horizons become a very important thing to her, and vastness becomes very important. Those words she uses and puts them in manners that I don't think would have been done except with the Native American culture.
I'm always struck by the line that says, we were taken along an upward incline of wooden boxes, which I learned afterward to call a stairway. To me, that's just a beautiful description, defamiliarizing us from stairways that we take for granted. But if you've grown up without any dwellings that had stairways, it would just look like a stack of boxes. And suddenly people start walking up them. That's the kind of remaking of the language, I think, that I see her doing pretty consistently in here. Telegraph poles that are planted by white people, by the pale faces, as if, why would you plant something that's not going to grow? You put these telegraph poles in there, and they're moaning as she listens to them. Beautifully written, I think. Dan?
I thought that part about the trees moaning was really stood out and encapsulates so much in just that one little bit, because it's not just her setting out her perspective on what has happened to her and to her people, but also to what has been done to the land and the way that she sees that so intertwined, and the grief that she feels for that also. That stuck with me.
So I have a question about just overall language. Do you believe that perhaps the Native Americans were discriminated so badly against was because they didn't have a common, like we had English and we had German, we had a variety of languages in the settlers, but they were sort of common because they didn't have a common language and therefore were considered very inferior for not having that. I mean, that's a question I have. I mean, I'm not saying it's true. I'm just saying, do you think that was part of their consideration of inferiority because they weren't speaking the languages that were accepted by the settlers?
I would think so. There was an arrogance about the white settlement that the Native Americans were savages because they couldn't speak English or a European language. And the people speaking European languages other than English got a lot of flack when they came. My German ancestors and Irish ancestors certainly weren't welcomed for their if they couldn't speak English either, even if they could. So yeah, I think their English was a power language, and it was the language of the people who had the guns and the money and the power and the numbers to impose their will on other people.
Go ahead, Abigail.
Oh, I was just gonna say, I see this even now in white culture perspectives toward non-white cultures, the assumption that difference equates to inferiority or lack of sophistication, or yeah, I think the the prejudice is betrayed in equating those things, where because of lack of knowledge of a language, how this people group communicates, even something like music. I have an uncle who went to a college commencement ceremony where there were presentations by Native American musicians from the people groups that were on the from that area, and then there were also I think he was in Minnesota, so it was like Swedish, like 19th century music, and it was shocking the language that he used to describe the difference between the two, and the way he didn't approach it as saying, oh, I don't know anything about this art form, I don't understand it. He automatically equated difference with inferiority, and I think we see that in a lot of ways between white culture and non-white cultures in the U.S. and more, but we'll talk about that.
I think what you're saying is similar to, I had my kids read The White Man's Burden, the poem, but then I also have them read the response, and I can't think of the guy's full name, but like Ernest Howard Crosby, I think. And so the first one is, it's set in the late 1800s with the Philippine American War, but like the white man's burden being to go help tame these half devil, half children over in the Philippines. They're talking about how great America is, but then, or all white men, I guess, but then the response to that is like, oh yeah, what are we bringing to them? We're bringing to them mortgages, and we're bringing to them taxes and executions, and like all these things that he's being very sarcastic about, like, oh, look at how great white culture is that we're bringing to them. And I think that's kind of how, like with language and culture, we see a culture and we automatically see it as simplistic and primitive, and that it can't be as good as ours. But just because it's simplistic in our eyes doesn't mean that it's not as good, or maybe even better in a lot of cases than what our culture is.
Yeah, I mean, think about the skill level of someone who is an oral tradition storyteller. They have to not only know the story and the right dialogue and the right, everything has to be from memory as opposed to just reading it. So think about how could you possibly say that a storytelling oral tradition is more primitive, when to me it seems like you need a lot more skill to be able to do that on a consistent basis than if you have the crutch of being able to read the words. Maybe I have the story more or less memorized, but I can check my words as I go if I'm reading it, as opposed to if I'm an oral storyteller. I don't know, that's just one example. Amy?
Sorry, I can't help it. I have to raise my hand. It's a habit. So the Paul Lawrence Dunbar House, which is also part of the History Connection that Harriet Beecher Stowe House is part of, is doing a whole big Paul Lawrence Dunbar at 150. And one of the movements in poetry, at least as far as my experience with some of their workshops, is that it's like there's a facilitator who's doing a big workshop, and they're considering poetry storytelling now. And so it's recitation of the poetry, which and I'm hoping to tie that to our stories because it's all language, but the movement seems to be recitation as opposed to reading. And it is terrifying to think that you're going to be reciting something without a script. Like, that's horrifying. But all of those things, all of those art forms kind of speak to each other. Theater, writing, poetry, and those are all of the language arts. And in both of those, theater and poetry, you are expected to perform. They're performative without the words in front of you, which is terrifying and gives me knots in my stomach. Needless to say, I somehow got signed up to do one of the workshops, and now I have to memorize the poem, and I'm terrified. Terrified. But that is the expectation, isn't it? When you tell a story, that you're doing it without the words in front of you. That's the norm. It's writing it down that's actually kind of the veering from that as far as stories go.
Yes, and if I could add that many times art forms like this, like poetry, are connected to other art forms. For instance, as I understand it, Bob Dylan didn't believe that he could write poetry without singing it. He's a poet, but it all is put to song. So he had to mold the two together. He didn't think that they could be separate. And as I understand from an interview he once had, yeah. So art and ritual have to come together in some of these things.
Let's go back to Emma and have her ask the third question, because I think this is an interesting one for us to consider.
Yeah, I thought so too. So both of her autobiographical writings and freedom narratives, like the Frederick Douglass portray racial oppression, but do you see any important differences between her story and the freedom narratives?
I guess maybe one difference is that when we look at freedom narratives like Frederick Douglass or Josiah Henson or even Harriet Jacobs, there's like an ultimate goal. This is, we're going to escape from this condition and go to a different place. Whereas I'm not sure there's any kind of escape mechanism with the Zitkala-Sa. It's more of this is the way things are. And it's not like she's going to change them. It's just, she doesn't want to change the way that she and her family and her, her tradition or culture are. It's just kind of describing the differences, maybe. People can expound on that. Amy.
I'll try. So with the freedom narratives, I think, I'm trying to think of how I want to say what I want to say, which is there was an attempt, it seems like, for a legal mechanism for change, but, and I'm not pronouncing our author's name tonight because I do not want to mispronounce it, because I think that it's important to pronounce things properly if I can. What's her remedy? I mean, this is her land, so moving isn't an option, and the colonizers aren't leaving, so that's not an option. I mean, like, I see more similarities than differences, to be truthful, but I think one major difference is what's her solution. So describing the condition seems like a better way to kind of open people's eyes as to what's going on, because her solutions are much more limited. And I'm not saying that, that the freedom narratives necessarily, that the people writing those necessarily had a ton more options, but she doesn't even have the options that they had. There's no legal remedy for her situation. I don't know how that, feel free to jump in, but like, I just don't know what, because like I said, I mean, she's not gonna be able to kick the Europeans out. That's not gonna happen. And she's not gonna want to lose, she doesn't need to lose her culture. That's not an option. Like, her options are not ideal, I guess is where I'm going with that.
Emma, without putting you too much on the spot, what do you think is a solution to saving your Native American culture?
That's a very good question. I think growing up, learning it, and having my dad he worked like really hard because he only had documents from his dad who had already passed. For whatever those documents were, they were very old and not very well read. So he worked really hard to bring that back. And I think it's really important to me to help in a way by going to many of like our gatherings. I go to Oklahoma maybe, I would say 4 or 5 times a year. So for those gatherings, I feel like it's important for me to be there to help keep this going and inviting. We have 2 summer camps that we do for children ages 6 to 18, and helping those children come in and learn about their culture. Thanks, for me as also a teacher, helps me like feel good about helping them bring it into their homes as well, if that answers your question.
Yeah. Thank you.
Emma, since you reminded us that you're a teacher, Emma, if you don't know, is a Montessori teacher. I wonder if you saw any parallels, this kind of relates to the second question, any parallels between the kind of education that the narrator was getting at home from her mother and the elders and Montessori, or anything close to your philosophy of education.
I think there are some similarities, especially with, I can't remember who mentioned it earlier, I think it was Dan, but moment where she was running in the fields, just very, very free and innocent, I think you said. And that reminds me of my school and having like our nature program part, our outdoor program, which helps the kids get out into nature who might not at their own home, or they might not have that opportunity. And so that helps them allow to have that freedom and exploring nature as they see it.
How about the beadwork that she learns from her mother?
I remember I was homeschooled until I was a freshman in high school. And at home, my parents would help include any Native culture. And so a lot of that would be like clothing and stuff we would make. Or my mom, she's not exactly Native, but she helps with the tribe and all of our like sewing and like ribbon work and stuff like that. And so beads are very popular in a lot of our clothing or artwork. And so, yeah, like our Montessori materials, we have all those beads and they're definitely similar.
Yeah, I thought that bead, oh, go ahead, Chris.
Oh, I was going to say, I thought the whole the scene about the making the coffee reminded me of Montessori education. It's like, okay, so you've seen it done once and you're going to try it yourself. And even though it wasn't right, you still, it was that sense of, you know, I can do this, or, you know, it's more of a hands-on. It's like, she's not going to get, you know, she's not going to read instructions on how to make coffee. She's like, I've seen my mother do this. I know how to do this. I'm going to follow the steps that I've seen her do before and make the coffee. And, you know, it sort of worked, but not really. And that's okay.
Yeah, exactly. Yes, I definitely agree with that.
I enjoyed the interaction between mother and daughter over the beadwork, that she has to learn to conform to certain traditions, but there's also a room for creativity that the mother allows her. She can pick colors, she can make her own designs, and she learns by trying that some of the more complex designs are too hard for her. So she backs off and does simpler things that she can handle. So she's learning all sorts of things, I think, just by living there with her mother and learning to be an artist in a way, because the talent that she puts into the beadwork in some ways is like the talent that she puts into her writing, I think. Anybody else see anything else that she learned at home with her mother that she didn't learn at school?
I liked how she would go and invite people to come back to their teepee, I think it was, or wigwam maybe. And my family's very like hospitable, like we have people over all the time, and so that's something that I enjoy. And so it was cool to see how she would go. But I thought it was really interesting that her mom had told her, you know, you don't just go ask people, you wait and make sure that they don't already have plans. And so she sits, or she kind of stands at the entrance and she'll wait and she'll listen. And so I think, you know, being able to pick up on social cues and seeing what people are doing and saying, I think that's huge. And that's something that our kids today are not getting. A lot of the social cues and what's polite and what's, you know, I think that's something that we are trying to teach more at school, but it was such a simple way for her mom to do that.
And she learns to repeat, to tell her mother exactly what happened when she made the invitation. And she says something like, I learned to tell it all, or to observe everything and to report it to her. What does a writer need to be able to do? To observe things, to retell them. So she's being educated in all sorts of ways that the people at the boarding school would think was a waste of time. They would, they would not be valuing that at all. In fact, go ahead, Kara.
Oh, I was just going to say, I think in so many ways, those people skills that she describes her mother teaching her became survival skills for her in the boarding school. Throughout the stories, she talks about someone's negative reaction and then says, we must have done something that made them upset, or we must, the way that she's kind of re-articulating that around is tragic to read, all these childhood memories of someone who should be having to keep themselves safe. But you can see how some of those skills did carry through for her in really important ways.
I thought it was interesting, the little piece about the devil and, the white man's devil, when she has this awful nightmare and wakes up. And we talk about her mother. I think the mother opened the door and the hinges squeak as the door opened very slowly. And then in rushed the devil. He was tall. He looked exactly like the picture I had seen of him in the white man's papers. And then here's the great part. He does not speak to my mother because he did not know the Indian language. Mm-hmm. In other words, the mother may have taught her that, some of this stuff is, and then she takes revenge on the devil with scratching him up with a pencil to the point where there's a hole in the paper. But I think what I've learned from the mother is, to make up your own decisions and that know who you are within and not what they teach you at these schools. But to me, that was very striking that the mother wasn't even affected by the devil because they didn't speak the same language, and it was kind of a bogus, apparition in the first place, maybe.
And Richard, if I could add, wasn't the picture of the devil actually in a Bible?
Right. Bible stories book, yeah.
A little bit of Bible where they put the pictures, and
yeah, right.
She found the devil in the Bible.
Yes, exactly. Yes. Yeah, that was what the white man's book, I think it was called, She Pulls from the Shelf. Yes.
And what's the first thing she goes after when she starts mutilating that picture of the devil?
His eyes, I think.
His eyes.
Yeah.
Why did she do that?
The window of the soul, isn't it the eyes, the window of the, but maybe because they're watching you, I don't know.
I think it goes back to something almost when she's on the train going east for the first time, and all these white people are looking at her.
Oh.
Identifying her as different. There's this white gaze that just runs through the whole book.
Right. Yeah.
And I think that's what she's seeing in the devil, is this white appropriating gaze that looks at her and says, you're not as good as we are. You're the other. You're something different, something inferior. And she's rebelling against that. I don't think she consciously knows that. I think she just wants to scratch his eyes out, but and then obliterate him. But it's also, go ahead.
Well, I was thinking later on when she's giving orations at, I don't know if it's at Earlham or one of the schools, there were boys in there with a flag that said squaw, that were waving that back and forth. And I think there was something in there that kind of reminded me of slavery, where she has a line prior to that where she says something about, the hatred that these people have, ruins their hearts were frozen hard with prejudice, is what she sees as the cold race. In other words, kind of like slavery naturally there's a victim of, the people enslaved, but there's also something that happens to those who are the slavers, where their hearts are ruined. I mean, the institution was awful for everybody. And I think the author has this great empathy to say, geez, these guys are, it's is it their fault or not? Or I guess, you know, that's up to debate, but it seems like she at least empathizes with the coldness that comes from this.
And everybody understands how offensive that word is that was on that banner.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
As a whole.
Didn't
I
mean
mean,
to say it lightly, right?
yeah, and I mean it's not really a Native American word. It's a word that
Yeah,
white
it's yeah, right. It's
Native American women. So,
mhm.
so yeah, she's particularly offended by that, but then by the general hatred. And I think that the attack on the devil is also interesting because Native, as she tells us, Native American religion doesn't really have that strong devil figure there. She said there might be evil
Right.
spirits, but they're no more dangerous than evil people who might be around you.
Yeah.
Whereas Christianity creates this horned, horrible devil creature. So it's a way of rejecting the whole Christian religion that's being imposed on her at that point.
Yes.
So that was one of my favorite moments in the book, and her moments of rebellion in the school. Remember the turnip jar too, where she's told to mash the turnips, and she keeps mashing and mashing and mashing. And so when they pick up the jar, the bottom of the jar falls out. These are forms of resistance, much like writing in English to undercut the power of the pale faces who are oppressing the Native Americans. There are different, you know, if you're a colonized person, you got to pick your battles and you got to find your ways to resist. And she's gradually working, you know, as a kid, you know, mashing the turnips doesn't change society very much, but it shows the spirit that's in her that will later get translated into being an advocate for her people. Any other issues or points that people were particularly struck by in the book, or questions anybody wants to ask?
I'm glad we read the stories.
That's good. I'm glad you're glad.
Well, and I also think it calls back to one of the earlier questions about what she learned from her mother. It made me think about one of the other selections we did a few months ago where we were talking about, I think it was all women writers in that particular episode, and like where young ladies learn from their mothers, or I think it was a short story about baking, if I remember correctly. And the conversation was about how those traditions are passed down in that way, which you need, if those traditions are gender specific, which typically they have been, then you need that perspective to share those stories. And I'm getting the same sense from these as well, that, you know, a lot of that perspective would otherwise be lost, and you're only going to get that from a girl who only was going to get that from her mother if you're using gender normative roles. So thank you for adding to that, to our canon for us.
Well, we could add more of her work next year. If we continue with the power of voice, we could do some of her short stories that are also very readable and very interesting to look at. So if there's enough interest, that might be something to go on the schedule for next year. We're booked for the fall, but if we do Power of Voice again, I think that would be that might be a good month to spend on some short stories of hers that are later in the book. So if you've got the book, you've got them. I want to say this about the end of the story. We're talking about the endings being very different in the freedom narratives, because at least the enslaved people get out of slavery. They may not be living a great life. Harriet Jacobs certainly has her complaints about the life she's leading. I don't own my own house. I can't live, the life I really want to live. But at least she's not enslaved anymore. And the journey north is unequivocally good. I mean, the North may not be great, but it's a lot better than the South in the time of slavery. And especially if you get all the way to Canada, like Josiah Henson, it's pretty good. Here, the journey, and this goes back to Dan's question to Emma much earlier about journeys and moving away from the land. The journey here, her family's already made a journey that they're not comfortable with, and away from their former way of life, hunting the buffalo. And and so she makes our author makes the journey east as a way of trying to protect her, people. So in a sense, she's going away from home, and she's never completely at home in the East any more than she would be completely at home. She and her husband visited the reservation frequently, although she never really reconciled with her mother, who never quite forgave her for going on to Earlham and leading the life that she led. But they were reconciled with a grandmother and with plenty of other people who appreciated what they were doing. But it seems sad in a way at the end of the autobiographical part, and because she's describing herself as somebody caught between two worlds: a petrified Indian woman, a cold bare pole, going back to the pole imagery we saw earlier with the telegraph poles. But at the same time, she hints at some resolution. She says she's resigned from Carlisle. She's heading east for more study. And then she says this, and I love this line that I hope you didn't miss near the end. Still, I seem to hope a day would come when my mute aching head reared upward to the sky would flash a zigzag lightning across the heavens. I love that line, and she did it. I mean, she fulfilled that. I think she that last autobiographical section ends with her seeming sad, but she's got that hope to build on, and she's making some comments about the people who visit the boarding schools, the donors who look so smugly at the docile Native American kids learning to do these neat little notebooks and things. And she reflects on the emptiness of that, but I think she's also looking back at them because she calls them specimens. I can find the quote, but she says they're specimens as they look at these kids and don't really understand how much harm is being done to them. It's this gaze again. Here are these people looking proprietarily at the native kids, but Zitkala-Sa is looking back at them and saying, she's got their number. She knows who they are. And she's gazing back at them in her own book, in her own words. So I think she's an amazing writer, I think. So maybe I'll let that be my final, my closing comment, and turn it over to Emma, who might have final words.
I mean, all I have to say is thank you guys for letting me join you tonight. It was great. And this was I've never heard of this book, but it was a good read for sure. Thank you.
All right. Well, I want to thank everyone for joining us this evening and for, as always, a great discussion about all these new kind of ideas that also seem to like make all these connections to other things that we've read, because apparently it's all still connected. I just, as a brief note, we do take the summer months off from this discussion series. So our next one will be in September. And John, I forgot to look at the schedule. Can you just give us a brief preview of what the September readings will be about?
Yes, there'll be some selections from Chinua Achebe's book, Things Fall Apart, and my co-discussion leader will be Jerry Klein Bailey, and some of you know from past discussions. And here's another writer who faced that colonial dilemma: should he write in Igbo, his native language, or write in English? And what he chose to do was remake English, so that when you read those selections from that book, you'll hear a very distinctive voice that has an oral quality that isn't, you know, he said, I couldn't write like Joseph Conrad. I didn't want to. I wanted to write my own kind of prose that would reflect my own people.
And I will make a brief note about that because I have not read that book, but I was doing a presentation the other day and I pulled up a picture that one of our board members / docents had, you know, kind of sent me to include in some of our talks and some of our tours. And that is, it's basically a picture that shows the BBC's listing of the top 10 books that changed the world kind of thing. And I mean, it's part of a bigger series of 100 books. But when you look at the top 10, unsurprisingly, there are only 2 women on the list. But of course, Harriet is number 2 and Mary Shelley is number 3. But then the only other, or the only non-European or non-American on that top 10 list is the Things Fall Apart book. So that's according to the BBC, which the top 10 was very Eurocentric, but Things Fall Apart was on the BBC's list of the top 10 books that changed the world.
And instead of just readings in there, well, we have some readings from there, but also I think there's a video you can link up to and watch too, an interview with him when Bill Moyers interviewed him. And he has some wonderful things to say.
All right. Well, thank you for the preview. Everyone have a wonderful summer, but don't be a stranger. Come see our outdoor classroom. Come visit just come take a tour, take a hard hat tour, or come to the birthday party, which is June 12th. I know I'm plugging lots of different things. Just go to our website because Abigail has it all listed on there as what we're showing and what we're doing. So again, thank you all for joining tonight, and I appreciate you and your contributions to the Harriet Beecher Stowe House.
Thank you all for a wonderful discussion. Thank you, Emma.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Emma. Thank you, John. Thank you, Christina. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. This was wonderful as always.
All right. Have a good evening.
You
Bye-bye.
too.
Bye.
Bye-bye.